Okay, great. Okay, so tonight we're going to be looking at the astrology of the coronavirus. Um, and I'm aware that some of you are around different places in the world, so thanks for joining in. Um, Okay, so what I'm going to actually be doing is going through what I'll be talking about this evening. Just to say, we are going to break for 5 minutes at 8 o'clock. In the UK here, it is a time where we will go outside and clap for the people that are working on the front lines. So just to let you know, there'll be a 5 minute break at 8 o'clock. So tonight, what I'm going to be talking about, the overview of what I'm going to be talking about is what astrologers look at. I'm aware that some of the people on here are very early students in astrology, and some of you are professional astrologers. So we've got all sort of different types of students and professionals. So I'm going to try and pitch this to at all levels. So for those of you who are beginners at astrology, please do bear with the technical stuff. And for those of you who are very advanced, please do bear with me while I am sort of speaking through the basics of things. So what I'm going to be looking at tonight is 2020 being a big year with the Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto conjunctions. I will explain those in a bit more detail for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about. Astrologers have known this is going to be a big year, right from the beginning and right to the end. And there's been a build up of this for quite a few years, which we've seen all around the world. um, for some of you, particularly my diploma students who are on here now, um, and also some of the certificate and even some of the LSA students that have just finished the mundane section as well. There isn't too much repetition in this as we've just covered it this month, but there will be certain things that we will be looking at, and there will be some things that will come up. So if you can bear with me on that as well. Okay, so and we'll be looking at where we're going to start with the coronavirus is really at the beginning and knowledge of the first outbreak. Um, so thank you to my student Wendy, who spent a lot of time sourcing some information for me, because we do have the date as the first sort of announcement from Science Mag um, in from China, who puts the 1st of December, and they reference a Lancet, but I've yet to find it, and I'm a subscriber, so sorry, Wingia. I haven't quite verified that, but I'm still looking. So we're going to be looking at the beginning of when it was announced, which was on the 31st of December 2019, and that's what we're going to start looking at. Then we're going to look at some relevant points in time that sort of come from that period, and of course, in particular, the particular large cycles we're looking at. And tonight we should also be looking at who is severely affected. And I say this on a very, both on a very broad level in terms of countries around the world and particular places on the planet, to actually specific groups of people. So that is what I'm going to endeavour to look at this evening. Um, and so also just to let you know, the next 2 nights are going to be quite differently themed. We will be still looking at this on a very social level, but we also will be next week having Graham Ibal with us as well, and we'll be looking at how anxiety can be managed during this as well. So we'll be looking at different types of astrology with that. So okay, so what do astrologers look at? Well, we look at planetary cycles primarily, and we look at these in comparisons to history. So if anything is going on, we want to know when the last time this happened, and we want to know what happened and what differs between then and now. I mean, besides the different way that we live, but what are the themes that are going to come out of that? So any particular points in history, and conversely, you can flip that on the other side, and that if you think of interesting points in history. When will they be repeated, and what themes are going to play out in that? And I'm going to mention a couple of ones this evening that are just sort of quite interesting, and we'll be doing more of this as we go along. Um, so that is the one thing we look at. And what we look at is when particular planets come together, and we call this a conjunction. So they're basically sitting in the zodiac at the exact same place, if you like. So from our perspective on Earth, for example, if you had Mars and you had Pluto in the same uh, longitude, if you like, um, uh, then you will see them as a conjunction. Now, some cycles take some all cycles have different periods of time before they come back and conjoin each other again. And I will go through some of those cycles which are happening this year. We also look at planetary lineups. And this year, particularly what has already been really in the last couple of months, we've had some sort of very extreme planetary lineups where you have a lot of planets residing in one place in the zodiac. So, what we've had in the last couple of months is a substantial amount of planets that have resided in the sign of Capricorn. And when you have a lot of planets in one particular area, then that's going to be emphasized a lot more. And everything that goes with that sign is going to be spotlighted. We also look at nations charts. And nations charts are when we are looking at a particular country and what um, their particular different births of that country, if you like. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, we use the 1801 chart, and that is when Britain became unified. So, all countries, England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, um, oh, and England, of course, became united. So, we use that chart. Of course, if Scotland ended up, or Northern Ireland ended up leaving the United Kingdom, we would resort to the previous chart, which would be the coronation of William in 1066. So some countries have mini charts. For example, in New Zealand, I think it's the 1907 Dominion chart we use, but I would also use the Waitangi the Treaty of Waitangi as well from 1840. So countries have different charts, but we need to look at these to see what is relevant and what's going on. We also look at leaders' charts and to see what is happening. So, for example, right now in the United Kingdom, both our Prime Minister, who is, of course, in isolation because he has coronavirus, um, we look at his chart, and we also would look at the Queen's chart as the head of state and what's going on with her as well, which has been quite a bit in the last couple of months, really. So we would also look at lunar cycles. So we look at the lunar phases, the new moons, um, the full moons, the new moons, and of course, what comes with that is eclipses. Some of the eclipses that are going on. Sorry, I've just got some chats here. People who are okay. So, so yeah, if you have any questions, do write them in the chat box. I may get to them if I've got time. I'll get to them. Otherwise, I'll look at them in the break. So please do send those. Um, so what we have this year, what we have is a, a a lot of outer planetary transits, if you like. And these are the main ones that we're really focusing on in looking at the coronavirus. I'm just getting my drawing kit here. So, most importantly, the one that very much stands out and the one that very much is about the coronavirus, in my personal opinion, is this one here, which is Saturn conjunction of Pluto. For those of you who don't know, this is the symbol of Saturn, and this is the symbol of Pluto, and this is the symbol of Jupiter. And so really what you need to be looking at most importantly are these dates. Now, what we have is on the 12th of January here, we had a conjunction of Saturn Pluto, and this was in the sign of Capricorn, which is the symbol here, and it was 22 degrees. Now, there are very few astrologers on the planet who wouldn't have thought, who haven't been talking about this being a rather significant point in time. I mean, it should be known that Saturn Pluto do sort of conjunct every, 32 years or so, um, but they do so in different signs. Saturn conjunct Pluto together in the sky has not happened since the year 1518, and this is very significant. So over 500 years ago, since we have had what we had in January, and we felt the build up to that for many years, and we're going to feel um, the waning of this really until the end of the year. Um, Now, the end of the year, that's not what I wanted. I wanted a arrow. Sorry. So at the end of the year, which we will talk more about on the last evening, is the Jupiter conjunct Saturn, and this will occur on the 21st of December 2020, which is quite a different cycle than this one. And it sort of feels like there's a battling of these cycles because they sort of have quite contrasting themes. One is very rigid and restricting, very depressing, very authoritarian, um, very deprived, and the other one is very much about freedom, democracy, um, equality, and things like that. So there's quite different themes that are sort of battling out here, and these themes are running at the same time. Now, before we sort of get to the end of the year, we're going to endure three conjunctions of Jupiter and Pluto. Now, Jupiter, Pluto, they conjunct roughly every 12 years, um, but these ones are more important. And Jupiter is the planet of expansion, so it exaggerates anything it comes into contact with. So when it comes into contact with Pluto, Pluto is often about sort of like birth, death, and taxes, if you like. But it's also, it rules the sign of Scorpio. It's a very intense, a very passionate, a very entrepreneurial, um, and it can be quite ruthless. It doesn't really take many casualties, and well, it certainly doesn't take casualties, nor does it take prisoners. So Jupiter's going to exaggerate this, and of course, that occurring in the signs of Capricorn. Most importantly, is the this last conjunction here, which is going to occur at 22 degrees of Capricorn. Now, this is at the same degree that this cycle happened in January. So, and it's very close. It's 24 degrees in April. So that is in a couple of days. It's on Sunday. So we're building to that now. There's other cycles going on too, but these are the ones I'm just trying to um, anchor here really. So the Jupiter Pluto is very close to that 22. It's at 24. Then it goes back. So often we see um, from our perspective on the Earth, it appears that these planets sort of separate again. And from our perspective on Earth, they look like they're going backwards, but they're not. But that's how it seems. And then they come back together again on that 12th of November in 2020 at that same degree of 22 Capricorn. So because it's at the same degree, it's going to trigger what happened here, and it sort of finalizes the cycle in my eyes. It's sort of, we are not going to see the end of this until that date in November. So this is a very important sort of point I want to make, because that's probably what you all really want to know, is when is it going to end? My own opinion is the 12th of November. After that wanes off, which probably is going to be weeks, it'll be making way for this cycle, which is going to sort of pole vault us into quite a different era going forward to next year. Life is not going to be the same, but it there's a lot of positives. It's not all doom and gloom. I realize that we're all self-isolating in our houses around the world, and no one ever thought this was ever going to happen, including astrologers, um, to this extent. So there is a lot of good that's coming out of this, and will continue to do so, particularly going into next year. Not that you're going to be isolated for that long. My own feeling really is this 12th of January started in, of course, in China. It's made its way to Europe. Probably New York is the epicenter of it at the moment, and that will probably we'll see that peaking probably at the 5th of April, and then of course then it sort of goes back. But there is of course some speculation on season and temperature here, so it's possible that it may move. I'm sorry, I know there's a lot of Kiwis and Aussies on this thing too, but it's possible that perhaps the southern hemisphere is a little bit somewhat protected at the moment with its better weather, higher temperatures, but of course that there is a threat if it isn't under control in the northern hemisphere, um, very very soon, that it could actually flip really, and the epicenter could sort of come down to the southern hemisphere, um, and things break up a little bit more in Europe and America. So, right, I'm going to just put up the first chart, which a lot of people are using. It's not a chart that I've spent a lot of time on, but bear with me for all of you who've not really seen many charts before. But this is a chart where a colleague of mine, Victor Oliver, who's also the editor of the Astrological Journal. So this is a chart that he's using, and this is the new moon, which was an eclipse. It was a solar annular eclipse, and this is so what this means is this new moon is we're looking at it from the location of Wuhan in China. And what we see here, most importantly, and this is a very big deal really, is you see here the moon at 4 degrees of Capricorn here. Actually, I might just try and use a spotlighter. That might be easier. So you see the moon here. No, that's not working. Sorry. The moon at 4 degrees of Capricorn, in the same degree as the sun, because it is a new moon. So the sun and moon are going to be at the same place. You also have Jupiter here. You also have Saturn here, and you also have Pluto here. Now, this is a massive lineup in Capricorn. And when it's set for Wuhan here, all these planets were at the top of the sky, basically. So they are all at the zenith of the sky, um, on the exact new moon on the 20 on that eclipse on the 26th of December. This is a really fascinating lineup for astrologers, not just because it's an eclipse, but because Jupiter is right there, which is about expansion. Um, and also that is echoed by the place that it is in the chart, which astrologers call the ninth house, which you can see here, which is also about spreading. It's about breaking borders with international borders, so we can see the spread there. But most importantly, it's the Saturn Pluto um, building in the sky as well, and it's at the zenith in Wuhan. It's not going to be at the zenith for everywhere around the world. It will be around the sort of same latitude as um, as Wuhan, but the further north and south you get, you'll see them in a different place. So this is right at the top of the sky. So this is quite an interesting point for us. Um, Now, I also wanted to just take note of, actually, it's more in the, yeah. So this chart here is, I want to just also bring your attention to the planet Neptune, which is here. And some of you, we were talking about this in class last week. Um, this is Neptune, and Neptune is in Pisces at the moment. Now, Neptune's cycle, um, is different, but it's about 160 to 172 years. Probably a bit off there, but I probably should know that. But the reason I'm saying that is I'm in my head. I want to bring us back to 1853, which was 177 years ago. Yes, that would be more like it. 177 years ago. Now, when Neptune was in Pisces, it stays in there for about, went in at 2010, about 13 years. Um, and so we haven't actually had Neptune in Pisces since the early 1860s. So this is a very special time, really. Um, and what we have is, in 1853, what's really interesting is that Florence Nightingale had just finished serving in the Crimean War. Of course, Florence Nightingale, for those of you who don't know, was pretty much the founder of the Institute of Nursing during that same period. Um, and Neptune and Pisces is about caring, and it is about um, looking after those who can't look after themselves, if you like. It's about the underdog. It also is about a lot of other things. It's like, Neptune is a god of the sea, so it's about our oceans, it's about water, um, and it's about connecting on a massive scale. And what happened when Florence Nightingale, when she finished serving in the Crimean War, she came out and she had started to implement rigorous hand washing, rigorous hand washing in all hospitals and all clinics, um, and things like that. So it was a real slogan, rigorous hand washing. That was the slogan, which is quite interesting because at the time in 1853, Neptune was actually at 1635 of Pisces. Now we're talking here, this, 16 degrees. Um, we're talking about just within the same degree. So this hasn't, so what I'm trying to say to people who perhaps are quite new to this is Neptune has not been at this degree since 1853. And when it was, Florence Nightingale was uh, making sure that every hospital had a rigorous hand washing policy to it. Just a really interesting little sort of point here, because now we have it back again, and the whole world is rigorously hand washing, which is rather an odd, strange thing, really, isn't it? Um, so what I want to go to now really is the this particular chart here, which is the chart of when the World Health Organization, otherwise known as WHO, declared a public health emergency of international concern. Um, and as we can see here, so this is only 4 days after that last chart I showed you. And this is set for Beijing, which is where the World Health Organization in China resides. And here now we have this lineup of Mercury making its way, it's a faster traveler, making its way to Jupiter, to the Sun, to Saturn, and Pluto. So you've got 5 planets here, all within 20 degrees. Yeah, 19 and a half even. Um, and this is very important in terms of how we, so really what we do is we think about all the things that are very, very Capricorn. And if we think of Capricorn, we think of age, we think of time. Older people are ruled by Capricorn. It is about getting older, but it is also very much about borders, creating borders with people. Hence, the building of all the political crisis we've had over the last couple of years. Um, and so, all these things that are Capricorn, it's about um, it's about ambition, it's about success on one level, but on another level, it is about ultimately fear. Capricorn is ruled by the planet of Saturn, and it is very, very, very scaremongering. And so Saturn will breed this fear. Now, we knew that this would breed fear. We didn't realize to what extent. Now, of course, I'm not saying, Capricorn is also a very real sign. It's about reality. It's very anchored. It's an earth sign. It's not deluded at all. So the fear is very real. But the fear is also consuming. And this is what we'll be talking about a bit more next week. It is the fear that everybody and when and both Saturn Pluto together are quite paranoid. They are paranoid. And when you get Jupiter there, which exaggerates it, then all of this becomes huge. Um, this is and then it's also um, it's going to affect every industry in the world, every and what Saturn and Pluto do. Sorry, I'm struggling to sort of pitch this to everybody. So what Saturn and Pluto do is Saturn rules Capricorn, so it's very comfortable there. But Pluto is the annihilator. It is the annihilator. It is the destroyer. So with Saturn and Capricorn, it is going to destroy every aspect of society that is rotten and that does not serve anymore. And it is ruthless. So it is going to, um, sorry, somebody has just unmuted themselves. So I just want to make sure that everyone stays muted, if that's okay. Okay, great. So, so it is about fear, and it's also fear of um, deprivation as well. And what we'll also be talking about next week as well is where Saturn is in your chart, where it is in your chart, and where that anxiety may lay, because it does lay differently with different people. Right now, people have different fears. Some are worried about their jobs, some are worried about their parents, some are worried about their children, some are worried about their neighbors, some are worried about their wealth or lack of, and some are worried about, you know, their home or whatever. So, um, yeah, so we'll be looking at Saturn and the anxiety that it breeds um, next week. And we'll be looking at later tonight who this is actually affecting as well. Now, so Saturn, Pluto, and Capricorn, along with all these other planets, um, not just sort of create anxiety, but it's very awkward. It's difficult. Um, and as Pluto, the annihilator and destroyer, it wants to bring down aspects in society, most importantly, those who are ruling it. So you do see leaders topple. And we have seen that over the last year or so in so many different ways around the world. Um, in fact, it's very rare to find a country whose leaders are, are highly respected. I can only think of one at this point. But so this is what we expect with a lineup of people, of planets in Capricorn. So it's tough. It's really tough. It's about endurance. It's about uh, having to, yeah, basically walk through the shadow to the light, and that is exactly what that Saturn Pluto in Capricorn are going to demand of everyone. And as they come back, as they travel through Capricorn and get to the end degrees, which Saturn will do, it's gone into Aquarius now, but it's going to go back into Capricorn. And when they're at that last degrees of Capricorn is when it's very, very vulnerable. And Saturn will do that in November, and Pluto will do that in 2023 and 2024. But by that time, other cycles would have certainly lightened um, things up by then. So I didn't want to cause um, any alarm there. But also, Capricorn is very cautious. It's very cautious. And of course, it's also very, very responsible. So that is what the call is at the moment, is for people to be responsible. And of course, there's the other cycle that's battling, which starts in January with the Jupiter, Saturn, and Aquarius. That is the most rebellious sign. So when you see people rebelling against this, this is because this is the build up to that Aquarius, these Aquarius themes, and you are going to see some of that rebellion. Now, I just want to spend some time talking about Saturn conjunct Pluto. Now, like I said, these planets conjunct every 32 years or so. Here is some of this is really just for your reference. I will be sending you recordings of this as well. So the last one here was in 1982. Sorry, 37 years ago. And this was at 27 degrees of Libra. But then these planets moved into the sign of Scorpio very quickly after this date. So you found the planets of Saturn and Pluto traveling through the signs of Scorpio. And in the mid to late 80s, we had the discovery of AIDS. And Scorpio is the sign of sex. So not only did we have sort of the discovery of AIDS or the awareness of AIDS, um, we also had a lot of uh, spotlighting on sexual abuse around the world that all sort of came out um, during that time. And of course, that was repeated when Saturn last went through Scorpio a few years ago with the Jimmy Savile case and all the that sort of thing that was going on. So that's what happened last time. Saturn was in Scorpio and Pluto was with it as well. But these are the dates for the last time. And here we have, of course, the last time they were in the sign of Capricorn, which is a really big deal because it's been over 500 years since we've had this. Now, of course, students and some people have heard this before. I talk a lot on this particular cycle, most importantly, because when Saturn and Pluto are in Capricorn, there is an overthrow of authority. And when in 1518 we saw this, it was only weeks before, just weeks, that Martin Luther pinned the 95 Thesis on the door of the church, which challenged the largest authority in Europe, and that was the Vatican. And it also created the start of the Reformation, of course, and the overthrow of that largest authority in Europe. And that's what happens. Capricorn is about the big boys. It is the old big boys club. That is what is so Capricorn, and with Saturn and Pluto there, it aims to dethrone them somewhat. I'm just checking because there's okay. Um, sorry, I'm just looking at this. I'm just looking at some of the questions that are coming forward. Um, Helen has asked me, I haven't got time to look at everyone's, but Helen's asked some interesting questions. Is there any astrological indicators that the virus is man-made? Also, I believe that with people who are dying, it's because the body starts to attack itself, particularly the lungs as well, with other organs. Are there any astrological indications of this that may be happening? Yeah, we'll have a look at that. I have to say, you know, again, to reiterate, all these planets in Capricorn, they're very, very real. There is a lot of conspiracy theories floating around. I've yet to read one that I believe. Um, and I think this is very important. And the reason I say that is I will tell you, well, I'll go come back to this chart here of, sorry, won't be a second. This chart here. Now, another point here, this is that we looked at these planets in Capricorn here, but another, this here I think is quite interesting. Some of you, my students have heard me talk about this, in that Mars, the day that the World Health Organization declared this a public emergency, we don't know the exact time. I've put it at 9 o'clock, but I'm not really looking at any of the houses or angles here for those of you. So Mars is at 27 degrees. Now that Mars in Scorpio is very much about the sewers, the dark, smelly, stinky, ugly sewers that we have to inhale, and it brings out the real ugly. It can do. It can also be very beautiful. There's a shadow, anyone who has Mars at 27 Scorpio, that's not a negative. This is this Mars at 27 Scorpio, quite interestingly. Let me just see. Is this the chart I want? No, that is not the chart I want. I'm sorry. Um, this is the chart I want. This is the chart of China when it announced um, on the 1st of October 1949, 1515 from Peking, and most Chinese use this chart. Um, and there are other charts as well, but I like this chart. But what's interesting, if you look, when I showed you that Mars at 27 degrees in the 31st of December chart, we see also here that um, China, the chart for China, this here is called the midheaven. It is the zenith of the sky again, is that Mars was exactly hitting this midheaven. Now, it needs to be said that Mars does this every couple of years, so it's not a big deal. However, with everything else going on, it becomes one. So this is really important just to note. Uh, there's other things going on as well. At the time, Neptune was opposing Saturn from this point here, which is the ruler of the chart, and all this. And there's a lot of other things. For those, Jupiter Saturn is going to come up and conjunct these, which is going to be quite positive, I would imagine. You've also had all the Capricorn stuff square all these planets in Libra. I'm not going to go too technical into this. And you've also had, of course, most importantly, all that Capricorn, that Jupiter Saturn conjunction um, at 22 degrees of Capricorn is exactly on the Jupiter here. So some of you can study this later when you've got the recording and stuff as well. So when it comes back to the question of is it man-made? I don't believe so. This here with that 27 degrees of Scorpio is rats, bats, and snakes. That is what it is. So I believe it is, and I've also I've always subscribed to the Lancet for the last 13 years. So I not that I keep up with all the articles, but I have read a lot of the articles that have come forward from the very early works that were done there. And this is clearly, there's not one doctor I haven't read that does not believe that this is animal to human transmission. And then the spread is human to human. I have yet to, there is nothing in any medical journal that actually has, that is even mentioned it. There, it is just taken for granted that this is a animal to human transmission. And that 27 degrees Scorpio is rats, bats, and snakes. And we did discuss in some of the classes as well. Scorpio also rules dogs as well. So there was some mention of whether dogs could spread it. It's going to be interesting um, as we move forward how dogs play out in that. You know, not everything is ugly and smelly. You know, dogs are incredibly loyal, um, as Scorpio, the sign of Scorpio is. Um, so I want to now talk about the Saturn Pluto conjunction for 5 to 10 minutes. When these planets come together, and particularly in Capricorn, I feel that they've brought out the gremlins in people. There's certainly not actually the gremlins within people. They've sort of reared their head and within nightmares. It's where darkest fears perpetuate, and that's what the Saturn Pluto has done. Whether you know, when we look back at this in hindsight, clearly we're going to learn a lot of what we could and couldn't have done, but only in hindsight. So, so I know some of you have seen this before, so forgive me for repeating it. But the Saturn Pluto conjunction in Capricorn is about regulation and new rules. It wants to slow things down. It needs to safeguard. Now, I was showing this particular slide a year ago. This is what astrologers think about. So, this is what we expect: a need to safeguard, anchor, correct. And it's also, this is about issues of globalization. And of course, this is interesting that everyone is now grounding flights. There is no globalization right now. Saturn and Pluto and Capricorn want to erect walls. They want to erect walls, hence Donald Trump and his Mexican border, his ridiculous Mexican border. But, you know, he has interesting stuff in his chart. You can see why he would say that, and you can look at America's chart. They're incredibly Cancerian, but it's about driving up walls. And it's not just the American Mexican wall either. It's Scotland with Britain. It's Northern Ireland with Britain. It's Catalonia in Spain. It's South American countries. So this, what has happened is Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn. Usually, it's like many things in astrology where there are two ends of the spectrum. And one can manifest very positively and one can manifest also very negatively. And we don't know how that's going to go. When you're talking about someone's personal chart, you can, if you know them well enough, you can see how things may unfold. When you're looking at massive things like this, we can speculate, um, but what you see is basically um, a very strong building of people who are divided on lots of things. Most importantly is politics. And we can see in the last year or two the growing hugely far left and hugely far right. And that is what these planets in Capricorn do. And it's very, and people are very, very passionate about this. And what this actual virus has done is actually those walls have sort of come crumbling down, really. So there, you know, there's a sort of seesaw perhaps going on with this. But we've been, and you know, I mean, look at the riots almost in every country before Christmas. This is no longer happening. So there is an overthrow of authority, and it's historical, governmental, and parental. It's happening at every level, and I will discuss these in much greater depths. and it's about rectifying the sins of our fathers, particularly with the millennial generations, which I'm going to talk about in a second as well. And this is the new generations, the generations who are basically born from the late 80s onwards, who are going to be in a very interesting position in terms of creating new industry, new forms of status. I mean, we're going to see, similar to what we did in 2008, Pluto went into the sign of Capricorn in 2008. It had not resided there since, for 240 years, since um, the 1770s. That was the last time Pluto was in Capricorn. So as soon as it went in 2008, again, astrologers absolutely expected a massive sort of uh, uh, massive global financial crash. This was not, and so we've expect this again. But the difference is that this new generation has a lot of opportunities here, um, and new ways to build their future, even though that seems very um, it seems very far away right now for that. Um, Sorry, Brazil went berserk. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, every country in the world has something, had some political problems. Um, but what also we are faced with is aging society. Um, this is a really big problem. And all these planets in Capricorn have highlighted this problem, and it's a really big one. Um, every country is suffering from an aging society. When I say suffering, I say that more about from an economic point of view. um, Countries, we are soon, very soon, in a couple of years, the biggest demographic of age is going to be, over 75-year-olds. Now, that's all fine and well and good, but we also have to have a welfare system that can cater for that, and a welfare system that provides pensions and housing and healthcare, which currently our system is not geared up to do, particularly in China. Now, in China, where the one child policy was for several years, there is one child paying into a taxation system that has to look after four grandparents. One person, four grandparents. Now, even though that seems terrible, it's also very similar in other countries as families have shrunk very much as well. And in the UK right now, there are over 12 million people over the age of 65. That is how many people are vulnerable to the coronavirus. Um, and for those of you who are more astrologically trained, if you like, um, this particular generation are the first generation in many, many years that are going to experience a Pluto opposition. So, what that means is for people who are born about 80 years ago, um, they are going to have Pluto in their chart, trigger their own Pluto from when they were born. Um, and yeah, that's very, very fearful. That's very fearful. And of course, it's not just um, about them being vulnerable to the coronavirus. Is several of their pensions or certainly investments have already been wiped off the stock market. So it makes them they are suffering, and they are a deprived group um, at the moment, and we who clearly need care and looking after. Now, when you have Saturn Pluto in Capricorn, Um, it's sort of like where death meets the Grim Reaper, if you like, in a way, and issues of fate and mortality are addressed. Now, I don't mean that there are, um, uh, I mean, this is, everyone's looking at death rates, mortality right now. Um, if there's any browser that's open around the world, it's how many people have got this and how many people are dying. This is going to, and this subject is going to be an interesting one, particularly with the difference of opinion on what the death rate of this coronavirus is. Now, the death rate initially was thought to be between 1 and 3%. That was in late January and early February, and going into looking at the China situation unfolding. Now, then Italy, of course, looked as if it was having almost a 10% death rate. Now, there's been a lot of different debates on this, and what about 3 weeks ago, I keep forgetting his last name. I'm sorry, Dr. Andrew, whoever stands next to our Prime Minister, um, he thought the death rate was 1 in 1,000, and now they're coming out and saying that perhaps it's 1 in 20,000, which is a very positive thing. It's a very, very positive thing if the death rate has gone from 3% to zero point 0.1 or 0.02. This is, you know, yeah, this is quite a difference. And it sort of shows the sort of morbid, how morbid this is. But it also, of course, on a very practical level, shows how many countries are not testing properly, because the testing figures, um, the infected figures with the death rates do not match up. So if you really want to look at the proper figures, look at somewhat a country who is testing everywhere and available. Um, I think that's more accurate, if you like. Oh, right. Emma Begini. Hi, Emma. Very interesting. In Italy, we have Tana, Thanatology, which is an afterlife group being formed. Wow. Um, that's interesting. This is also because I have mentioned this to the diploma students before, but when you have Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn, they are evidence based. Capricorn wants proof. It is about proof. It is not deluded. It is not imaginative. It wants raw. It wants the right figures. And interesting, this is why WHO, the World Health Organization, keeps saying testing, testing, testing. That word testing is Capricorn. It is Saturn that rules Capricorn. So this is very important. Testing, testing, testing. And only when we do testing, we will know the accurate figures. But in the meantime, with fate and mortality, proof is going to be needed. That younger generation is going to say, ask questions about the afterlife. Older people are going to ask questions about the afterlife. Is there an afterlife? Saturn and Pluto and Capricorn get rid of all of the sort of philosophical and religious dogma. That is what Saturn, Pluto, and Capricorn does. It gets rid of it. And I have said this in different talks before, but this generation is going to question reincarnation, and it's going to question things like Christianity's heaven and hell. Is there a hell? Is there a heaven? Um, so that is what Saturn, Pluto, and Capricorn will ask. And they'll ask to prove it. Prove that reincarnation exists. Prove that karma exists. What goes around comes around. It was meant to be. They are aspects of karma. Prove it. We can't. That's what Saturn and Pluto and Capricorn are going to do. I'm going to come back to Helen's question in a minute when we come back. We're going to break for 5 minutes. And so so if everyone just takes a 5-minute break, and I will be back to you in no time. Okay. Well, that was very moving. Um, and this is one of the more beautiful sides of what's happening, of course, at the moment. Um, and it started in Wuhan with people in their apartments yelling from their apartment windows, "Wuhan is strong." And then we had it in Italy with singing from the balcony. And then from um, uh, we had it in Spain with police, well, singing as well, but also the police um, cheering up the people as well. And here in the UK, we have people clapping, cheering, and pop banging um, from their windows or from outside their property, which is fabulous. And this is very much about the Neptune and Pisces I was talking about as well. Neptune and Pisces is very much about bringing people together. Again, this sort of conflicts with the Saturn, Pluto, and Capricorn. But and the Neptune and Pisces, um, it's quite beautiful. And I just want to say that when you look at the UK chart, um, Neptune formed a beautiful grand trine at 18 degrees of Pisces. It formed a grand trine um, with the UK's chart, and I'm talking about the 1801 chart, with the moon at 19 of Cancer and Neptune at 18 of Scorpio. And where Neptune is in the moment in the UK chart is in the sixth house. And I think it was really beautiful the day that Neptune exactly made that grand trine, which is very, very harmonious. It's beneficial. It was that day that the UK did a pledge for volunteers for the National Health Service. The target was 250,000, and in one day they received over 500,000 volunteers. That is one of the really positive things about um, about. Oh, oh, can people hear me now? Sorry, I'm just. Can someone tell me if you can hear me? Not really.
It's your mic, Wendy.
Yeah, my mic's on my headset though, so it's never
Close to your mouth.
Is that better?
Yes. Yeah, great.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Sorry, guys. Okay, thank you for that. So yeah, this is really important when you're looking at other things as well. Now I do want to sort of come back to that Saturn Pluto conjunction. Let me just get this up here. Now, the Saturn Pluto conjunction occurred on the 12th of January. This is set for London. Now, I'm going to come back to Helen's question, and I've noted what Greg and Anna Maria, I think it is, who have made some points that I'm going to come back to as well. So Helen asked about this is a virus that's attacking people, and it attacks everything and the lungs. And yes, that's completely true. And what I want to sort of draw people's attention to, this is when the Saturn Pluto became exact on the 12th of January. And what we have here is some very valid points in that within just we're talking about 1.5 degrees here. We have the Saturn Pluto conjunction in the sign of Capricorn. But with it comes the Sun and Mercury. Now, Mercury rules the lungs, it rules our central nervous system as well, but it rules how we breathe. It's our breath, it's the ability to breathe. And right next to Pluto Saturn is a restriction on breath. That's where I see the lungs coming in. I quite liked what Anna Maria actually said. It's a confrontation with death at every level, but I see it as a breaking down of the ego's defenses. Well, yes, the ego is ruled by the sun here, which is also in this stellium of planets. It also rules the heart, of course, as well. That has not yet necessarily been a factor, as a major factor in underlying medical conditions. However, there's also something else that's important too. The chart when we're looking at social or global astrology, the sun is about leaders. It is about the the top dog becoming sort of annihilated here. And so we've already sort of seen that. Quite interesting when the new moon hit uh, the other day when it conjunct in Aries. Um, actually, I'll leave that. I'll show you the chart. It's probably easier I do that. So this here I think is where the lungs are involved, but of course all coronaviruses and many other viruses also involve the lungs as well, and here mercury is not involved. One thing that I think that has been brought up, as someone said, it attacks itself. Now what we have in this chart is Mars here in Sagittarius, the moon in Leo as well, and are actually what um, are considered unaspected planets. For those of you who don't really follow unaspected planets, it's when a planet does not make any major, that is a Ptolemaic aspect to any other point, any other planets in the chart. So what we have is an unaspected moon in Leo and an unaspected Mars in Sagittarius. You can see them here trining Mars trining Chiron. You can count Chiron if you want. I would as well. But what I think, again, it sort of reiterates what has been said about the ego. I'm sorry, someone keeps unmuting themselves, so I'm just going to click mute again. Um, uh, this is the also incredible amount of fire we have had in the last couple of months. We have had no air and we've had no fire. So we have been sort of stuck with a lot of earth and water, which is no problem with earth or water. But when you've only got earth and water, it's mud and it's a slog and there's no ideas floating around and there's no fire and there's no motivation, there's no push. But this moon in Leo that is unaspected, it's unaspected in a fire sign, perhaps echoing what Anna Maria said um, uh, about the ego, breaking down of that ego. So it sort of does echo this in some way. And if you don't count Chiron, then you have the Mars is unaspected. Now, when you set this particular chart for Canberra in Australia, you will find these planets quite interestingly placed because they are the only planets in fire. And at the time of this conjunction, Australia was horrendously under black and pink clouds. Um, it was, the whole, it was, like a fight of the gods, if you like. Um, Sorry, just get rid of that noise. If we also look at the Saturn Pluto conjunction on the global map, then what we have here is, and of course, the Sun and Mercury are with it, but this is on the world map. So here is Saturn Pluto on the midheaven. Now, this is on the conjunction. And as you'll see, this goes straight through Washington, D.C. and New York. Now, on the 12th of January, the president was being impeached. And this is exactly what you would expect. You also yeah, I mean, we can break this down a little bit more, but you can see where these lines run through, what countries they run through, particularly like the Caribbeans here in the South Americas. You also see Saturn Pluto on the descendant for New Zealand and Wellington here. And with students, I thought the shooting in Christchurch was part of that Saturn Pluto conjunction. Um, I thought it was the Saturn Pluto conjunction, clearly not. It was an introduction to it, really. But so you see the countries that are brought in here. Um, and what I find quite fascinating is, on one hand, you have an impeached president um, here in this area here. And yet, on the other side of the world, you have the only prime minister that's probably got any respect at the moment, and that is Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, and the way that she deals with crises like this, in particular the shooting in Christchurch. Um, so this is where we're looking for, and this is why New York, perhaps New York, is at one of the epicenters. Um, and I will next week. I've got the other chart with Wuhan on it. I'm sorry. I don't know what, it's not on here at the moment. It's on another PowerPoint. Um, so, what I want to just say really on tonight's one is also to look at, it's important to note that um, when Saturn and Pluto come together, they are not strangers to viruses or outbreaks. And what we've had is, where's my notes here? Um, and when you looked at that list I showed you earlier, we had the, thanks to Andreas, plague of Justinian in the years 541 to 542 AD. We had the smallpox outbreak in 1520, which I showed you the date of that 1518. And that was when they were in Capricorn. Now, when they've been in other cardinal signs like Aries, we had the bubonic plague in 1350, or the third plague in 1855. So these are not, so when we've had these periods before, these conjunctions, um, uh, this is what has happened. This is also to do with Chiron as well. Chiron, interestingly, has a 50-year cycle, and so you can tie that up with the 1918 Spanish flu, which is not really Spanish. It needs to be pointed out. It was actually derived from Virginia in America, I believe, and it was actually more about the English and French troops in the trenches. So Spanish were just the first to declare it. So that's why it ended up getting called the Spanish flu. That was exactly 100 years ago. So Chiron was at the exact same point it was that it is now. And similarly, in 1968, we had the Hong Kong flu as well. So you do see these cycles playing out, and when they come together, it's even more so. A lot more difficult to predict, I should say. But it sort of gives you, But if you're working in that area, if you're working on things like that, then these are the sort of things you're looking at. But of course, um, it's always easier to see in hindsight, of course. Um, and I want to sort of take you back to 1518 or 15 when that last Saturn Pluto conjunct in Capricorn. Now, these are images from European towns. Sorry, some of you have seen this before. Um, in 1518, there was a dancing disease. It was called a dancing disease. Now, with Saturn, Pluto, and Capricorn as well, you would expect the weather to be a lot colder than it is. Perhaps with climate change, it would have been a lot colder um, uh, right now during the winter than in several decades with Saturn, Pluto, and Capricorn. Because Saturn, Pluto is about being frozen. It is about freezing. It is cold. Um, there is no light there, and particularly with the sun there in that conjunction, that is also sort of brought into that theme as well. Um, but so the Saturn Pluto conjunction the last time it happened in Capricorn in 1518, or this is a couple of weeks after, before I should say. This village, there was a village in Germany that was documented for having a dancing disease, and it was put down to starvation, because of the cold weather, and therefore people couldn't eat. They had no access to crops and things like that, so they were starving. And of course, you can feel that same fear of deprivation right now around the world. Well, not necessarily with food, more with toilet paper, really, but you can see that sort of thing going on right now. So people are scared of not having food. Um, but what I think, and so what these happen is these people would come out of their village, come out of their houses, I should say, in the village, and they would start uncontrollably shaking. And this was put down to a dancing disease. Now, it was found later that many decades and even hundreds of years, it's been sort of a source of interest for a lot of academics. This and a lot of different debate on what it is, and it really sort of goes back to starvation. But it was found that there were many pockets in Europe that suffered this. There wasn't just one village in Germany; it was around Europe. So this is very interesting in that, I mean, my own take, and I think in hindsight, when we can see what's happening, is this is anxiety. This is society suffering on a massive anxiety level. Um, and it is uncontrollable body shaking, and people basically die till they dance till they drop, and that's sort of what's gone on here. Um, right, everyone. Okay. And I want to talk about. Oh yes, this is just interesting. I mentioned this to my students in the last couple of weeks about the Pied Piper, which is supposed to be around that. This is really from Dalby Costello, who we've talked about this, and she sees the Saturn Pluto conjunction in Capricorn is very much about the Pied Piper. Now, the Pied Piper, it's an interesting myth, because it is really quite, mythical, really, uh, in terms of what it represents. And it is a very Saturn and Pluto Capricorn story in that the Pied Piper was employed by the village mayor, and the mayor wanted the piper to get rid of all the rats in the city, in the town, and that is what he did. He played his flute and he drew all the rats away from the town. Now, and of course, we spoke about this, Darby and I, well before, we're talking about, around September, I think, last year. Um, and what happened is the mayor never paid the Pied Piper for his good deed. And so the Pied Piper played his flute and drew all the children away from the town. Now, we were talking about this last year, her and I was talking to students about this in January or early February. Now, it didn't really occur to me at the time when we were talking about this, and it probably didn't to Darby either, and that this, uh, when the Pied Piper drew the children away from the town, it was to take them away from their parents, um, and their grandparents, which is happening. The children have nothing to do with their grandparents right now unless they're living in the same home as them. But what is also fascinating is that children, and I know there are one or two, well, not one or two, there's children that have died from coronavirus, but it's an incredible bonus that children are not infected in the same way. And when you think of the Pied Piper leading the children away from the town, um, it always appeared so sinister. But actually, maybe it was uh, maybe it was actually has a different truth to it now that we can look at it from actually rescuing the children. Um, and I just think this is very symbolic, really, because and children are so immune to this. And I say this because of the articles I've read, on this, and I've looked at some of the case studies that were done in Wuhan on families um, trying to trace contact and this sort of thing. And it shows you all the different people with all their particular symptoms every day, um, and where the children have just stopped. They have they have symptoms, and then it just stops after one day. And a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, who lives also in West London, her and her husband have had coronavirus, and when their 8-year-old son got it, he woke up in the morning and he had headaches and a fever, and but by midday every symptom had gone, while they sort of walked through hell and back. Um, and lots of concerns because he is an asthmatic, but he is fine. He's absolutely fine now. They both are. They all are. But there's something really beautiful about this, about actually where children are not uh, as highly infected, and it's not as contagious. And I talked about the aging society that are deprived. Um, but I also want to talk about another generation that's also suffering at the moment. And I'm not to say that everyone is suffering, of course, everyone. But there is another generation that is really not being talked about right now. And again, they never really do get talked about. And this is the nature of Capricorn. Capricorn are not really strong victims. Um, they are strong people. They are, sorry, I'm just writing myself notes. They are, they just endure. And the generation, the millennial generations that were born between 1988 and 1993, now it does include people for the few years before and for years after as well, are directly affected by this conjunction. They're really affected, and the suffering and the demands and the expectations are really overwhelming for this generation. And the reason for that is they have um, I'm sorry, they have two or three planets in their chart in Capricorn, because during that period, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune were going through that sign. So most of these people have Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune in Capricorn. Some of them will have two, and some of them before that time and after will have it. And they are suffering unprecedented anxiety right now. They are considered to be the overparented generation, from parents like me who are, helicopter parents or whatever like that. But I also actually think they're underparented, this generation. They're underparented because they've had to make their way in the world of social media without regulation, without rules, without authority, without proper guidance and policing, which is so Capricorn. So they have had to bring themselves up themselves. This is really, even though they're considered overparented, I actually think they're underparented. So all those really born from like 85 to even in the late 90s have a planet in Capricorn. So this is going to be triggered by these planets that are in the sky right now in the sign of Capricorn. They're going to be triggering all of those. But they've been held hostage to this. So, and they've had to fend for themselves. Like I said, status, and sorry for you, all of you that have heard this before, but this is the generation where status is not based on, who you know, what you know, where you're going to, the social ladder is quite different than every other generation that has gone before them. It is dependent on how many likes they get on Facebook, how many followers they have on Instagram and Twitter and things like that. So this is a new form of industry, and this is going to again sort of grow to enormous heights, particularly with this pandemic as well. They will learn to fast track to maturity because they have no pause button with those planets in Capricorn. They are ambitious, they just don't know how, and they don't know why, and they don't know what. And that is pretty much because it is Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Quite different things. Like Neptune in Aquarius and in Capricorn is more about dissolving boundaries. It's harder to be motivated. So This is a struggle for this generation. Whilst they have a fear of failure, where are they going? So, this is a generation that is highly anxious. The whole world is suffering anxiety right now, and we can see this with planets in Capricorn. That is what it is, ruled by Saturn. Saturn rules anxiety. But it is not neurotic. It is very important to say that Capricorn is far from neurotic. It is anxious, but it keeps it to itself. So this generation is in crisis. So we have two groups of people in society that are very vulnerable right now. That is the older generation and the younger generation and the millennial generations. And it's also important to note that, particularly as we can see with Neptune and Pisces, which rules all drugs of all forms, from prescription to street drugs to whatever. Um, this is about this is also about prescription um, medication, and I think this generation is a heavily medicated one. And when we have planets in Capricorn, it usually triggers the opposite sign. The opposite sign of Capricorn is Cancer. And I want to just, these are words, really basic words associated with Cancerian and Cancer. So anyone who, so that older generation has Pluto in Cancer, but at the moment Pluto is in Capricorn, so it's opposing it. But these keywords, very simple, basic keywords of Cancer is feelings, food, family, home, caring. So the axis of Capricorn Cancer is very much, seesaws with this. We are all in our own cave. We are all in our own home. Everyone is buried in their own home. They are worried about food. They are either with family or not with family. So you're either with family or deprived of it in some way. Those who are heavily medicated cannot feel. Those who can are suffering really strong anxiety. And the difference between Capricorn and Cancer really is a difference between scaremongering and caremongering. That is the sort of polar opposite of that Capricorn Cancer axis. Um, what did I want to say? I might just come back to these questions just for time and stuff. Um, yeah, Greg says optimistic revelation on death rates with the Jupiter Pluto conjunction. Yes, absolutely. When those planets of Jupiter and Pluto come together in April, June, and November, um, particularly the first one, it is an optimistic, because Jupiter is also not just exaggerates, but it's also very hopeful. It's very lucky. It's very optimistic, glass half full. So with Pluto, on one hand, it's optimistic about the death rates. So you're right, Greg. That absolutely will be the case. Perhaps on the next conjunction in June will also be about uh, the coming back from that, sort of coming back from the figures that were thought to have been in April. Also, Jupiter, Pluto. Pluto is also the Lord of wealth, and Jupiter is about exaggeration. So when you get Jupiter, Pluto together, you're going to get a massive. Everyone around the globe is going to be going. Well, they already are in quantitative easing. So basically, the government's writing blank checks out, which we have to. And of course, everyone's in the same boat. Usually when you're writing out blank checks, quantitative easing for a nation, you know that your currency is devalued. Well, everyone's currency is devalued. So in terms of markets, I mean, it needs to be frozen. These planets in Capricorn are demanding for the economy to be frozen, and that is what it will do. If we don't do it, it'll happen. You know, um, if we don't, I mean, of course, Donald Trump is trying to take the power of that, and well done, I guess, for trying. But it's bigger than him, I'm afraid. Um, I'm just looking at other questions. Thanks for the info on South America. Oh yeah, Kieran. Thank you, Kieran. The Pied Piper also alludes to the way people are hypnotized by the media and lead away by what sounds good to a bad end. Oh, I like that. That's great. Yeah, yeah. And he says many children are moving back with their parents. Absolutely. Yeah. This is a Capricorn thing. It's about and reluctantly as well. You can this is about reluctance to do that. Some people are together as family, by not by choice really. Anna Maria, don't you think it is exactly Cancer which is being activated during this crisis? No, I think it's the axis of Cancer Capricorn. Capricorn is the authority. This is a lockdown. Cancer is not about lockdown. Cancer is the way we deal with it. Um, and all of this we can see working out, but it's the polar axis. This is lockdown. This is testing. These are all Capricorn words, Saturnian words. um, and so and it's important to say as well with these massive lineups in Capricorn, we've also had a lot of lineup in Pisces as well. And Pisces, when you've got all that water and Pisces and Capricorn, it is doom and gloom. It is doom and gloom. The day that Saturn actually went into Aquarius, the day that it went into Aquarius was the day that Boris Johnson came out and announced that there would be a new antivirus drug, antibody drug, very soon to test how many people have had it. And I mean, my own personal feeling is I think millions have had it. Um, Purely by when you look at the real accuracy of the death rates, we're looking at millions here, and of course varying degrees of symptoms. So I think, and that day when he came out and said we can have this testing for antibody drug to see who has had it is a massive game changer. That means all these people can go and work for the NHS, all help people do and get back into the workforce or get back into helping others, that sort of thing. So um, we need air, and we haven't had a lot of air lately. We've had too much water and earth, and we haven't been able, because there's no planets in air. Then ideas are not generated. When ideas are not generated, when you're looking for a vaccine, and you need a whole lot of medical teams um, on trying to do this, it's really difficult with no air and fire. Very difficult. I want to just end with this particular chart. Let me see which one it is. Do I have it on here? No, not that one. I may not have it on here, but that one. No. Um, no, I don't have it on here. So what? I'm just going to put the UK charts up there for now, so you can have a look. For those who want to have a look, the when Chiron actually I'm going to be able to put it up on here. Oops. Bear with me 2 seconds. So I want, yes, this is what I want. Great. So this is the new moon for the 24th of March from last week, um, Tuesday last week. I thought this was really interesting. Okay, I've had the same question now too. Okay, I'll come back to these questions in a minute. This is the new moon for last Tuesday, and what we had here was the sun and moon in the at. Let me just draw this for you. 4 degrees of Aries. So it was a spring equinox. It's 4 days earlier because the sun moves 1 degree a day. So on the 20th of March, it was the spring equinox, and then it joined the new moon last week. Now, what I think is really interesting about this new moon is it is conjunct. So in the sky, it also meets with Chiron at the same degree. So these are 4 degrees, and this is 5 degrees. Yeah. Um, and what I think is interesting, again, we go back to the sun being the king or the leader of the country. One day later, 1 day later after this, which I'll just put up here. 1 day later, the sun and Chiron were both at 5 degrees here. On that day, the 25th of March, we had the announcement that Prince Charles had coronavirus here in the UK. Now, this is the sitting king, if you like, or not the sitting king, the king in waiting, the king in waiting. And what you're going to see with this new moon this month, so I'm just telling you this because it's for the next, um, 28 days, really, 28, 29 days from the 24th of March. So you're going to see leaders sort of not well during this period, and which is very threatening for society, really. When the big boys go down. So when you have sitting kings, and then a couple of days later, the Prime Minister of the UK, and all that sort of thing happening. And what I think is quite fascinating about this, um, that I just want to really finish on this particular note, up a lot of this next week, but when you have the sun and moon conjunct Chiron, now they wouldn't have done this um, for a long time. I will find out exactly. I mean, it could be, um, yeah, decades or hundreds of years. I don't know at this particular point. Um, so, sun, moon, and Chiron in the sky. Now, the mythology of Chiron is that he was born a centaur. Um, his mother ran away from her rapist, and the rapist turned himself into a horse and raped his mother, and she then gave birth to a centaur. And Chiron, at an early age, was poisoned by an arrow that shot him in the leg. There's variations of the myth of how he was shot in the leg with this poisoned arrow, but nevertheless, he lived most of his life in a cave where he endured and suffered. And then he learned the wise teachings. He learned to endure his pain, which he lived with for most of his life. Um, so he learned to heal, and he learned a lot about medicine. He is known as a, a, you know a medicine teacher. He practices astrology. He is considered a wise person, a mentor, a healer, a teacher, and hence why they call him the wounded healer, Chiron being the wounded healer. And what is quite interesting about this is not only are we living right now through this month, all in our caves, we are enduring, we are suffering, the whole world is suffering. We are in our caves. and we are in there and we are enduring, but we're also learning as well. And we are learning about things like healing and matters of health. This is why we are in our cave right now. But also, what I think is really fascinating as well is Chiron, and this came out in one of the LSA nights for the students there, really, is that this Chiron um, is about um, when you think about what the whole world is waiting for, the whole world is waiting for a poisoned arrow. That is what it's waiting for. That is what it's a vaccine. And a vaccine effectively is an arrow filled with poison. So, in this particular month, we are going to see Saturn has now moved into Aquarius. Mars is already there. Sorry, let me just get off this. So now we are here, and now Mars has also joined Saturn in Aquarius. Now, this comes with another set of interesting points. We also, as you can see, have this Jupiter Pluto as well. So the Saturn Mars on one hand in Aquarius is fantastic. It is now it is lighter. Even though Mars Saturn is very militant, it's incredibly disciplined. This would have to be Mars Saturn. We are all in lockdown. We have no choice. Who would have ever thought the entire planet pretty much is, under this? But it's, even though it is, we have no choice and it's lockdown. And I mean, of course, this is going to differ between country, but certainly in the UK, even though it is enforced, um, we don't have the army on our streets or anything, so far. Um, so, but with Mars and Saturn in Aquarius, and Saturn will go back into Capricorn though, things are lighter. Things are much, much lighter. So there is a generation of ideas. And this month, in terms of the vaccine for Chiron, that poison arrow, we are going to have developments with that. Possibly when the moon goes into air signs as well. So when it goes into Libra, when it joins them here. And also another player as well is now Mercury is out of the shadow of retrogradation, which was at 12 degrees of Pisces. So it's moving very fast to catch up to where it would have been. Um, but another interesting date this week, before we meet next week, is going to be this one when Mercury meets Neptune, and there's going to be a time where that opposes. Yeah, it's going to be very fast. Yeah, it's not going to square. That's okay. So that is what is going to be an interesting one to watch over the next week. You've got the Jupiter Pluto conjunction, the Saturn Mars conjunction, and the Mercury Neptune conjunction, and we'll be addressing those next week. Now, just one last thing. Someone said, "What does this effect have on food?" Well, it's about deprivation of food. Um, that's what it. That's what it's. That Capricorn opposite, all those planets opposite Cancer, is a deprivation of food, or a real concern that one will not be nurtured or nourished in some way. um that's what it um means. um oh yeah, Cancer also a stirring of national unity. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, Monica, Saturn, isn't it about Saturn opposing Cancer? Yes, it is. That's what I'm saying. It's the axis. Absolutely. Yeah. Emma Begini saying, looking at Trump's chart. We're going to be looking at some of these charts next week. So if everyone wants to, yep, I'll put you all on the list. I think you've all got, some of you who registered on the website the have the links, but I will email you all tomorrow with the recording. Um, And so have a good evening, everyone, and take care, keep safe. And in the meantime, email me with any particular questions, particularly any countries that that you may be dialing in from, because we will be looking at all of that as well. Okay, take care.